This is an I Am Listening original podcast.
This Conservative government has forgot to govern. They've been too busy thinking about themselves and how to look after the Conservative Party. This is what's not happened with this government. Yeah. They've put party first and not the country, and that is what everyone is fed up with.
Welcome to the Kent Politics Podcast, your go-to source for insightful discussions on local and national political matters. Join us as we take a deep dive into local government across the county. Find out what the key decision makers have to say, what your money is being spent on, and how the party's policies could affect how we live. Plus, don't miss our regular feature, Westminster Watch, where we dissect the latest developments and decisions shaping the political landscape in the heart of the UK's capital. Engage with us as we delve into the issues that matter to you and explore the dynamic world of politics from a Kent perspective.
Welcome to the Kent Politics Podcast. In a week, Chatham Docks' future was finally decided. We got the latest on the Eurostar services in Kent, and we try to solve a 6-month mystery. I'm Simon Finlay, and I cover Kent County Council, and I'm joined by Dan Essen, who keeps a beady eye on borough and district councils.
Hello.
And Robert Boddy, who reports on Medway Council.
Hello.
We're also joined by KM Group political editor Paul Francis, who will be bringing us his thoughts on the general elections so far.
Hello.
Hello, Paul. And our special guest is David Naghi, who's hoping to become the new Liberal Democrat MP for Maidstone and Malling. Robert, it's never a dull moment in Medway. What's been happening this week?
So we've covered before the saga of the Chatham Docks planning application. Well, it's now been approved and has been about as controversial as expected. Now, I've been to many planning meetings and I'm usually one of just a handful of spectators, but at the special planning meeting the other week, just considering Chatham Docks, there were probably around 100 people in the public gallery, mostly workers from businesses on the site, such as ArcelorMittal Kent Wire. The atmosphere was tense, and as the planning officers went through the application and detailed their reasons for recommending approval, there were shouts and heckles from the audience, who had to be told to be quiet several times.
OK, so how did the vote turn out and what was the reaction?
Well, during the debating stage, the Tory members and the independent group councillor said that they understand the application raised strong feelings, but wanted to consider it as objectively as possible. They say they could see some value in potential modernisation of jobs, but on balance, they argued the site should retain the jobs it currently has rather than chasing the promise of others. Meanwhile, the Labour side were fairly quiet and only significantly contributed following the Tories accusing them of having nothing to say. They said they were considering the application in front of them and listening to officers, and the Tories had done a U-turn from their position when they were in charge of Medway Council when they wanted to approve the application. Ultimately, the Labour majority on the planning committee voted to approve, and the Tories and independent group councillor voted against, and there was uproar in the room, shouts of disgrace, shame and much worse.
Oh dear.
After the meeting, Phil Taylor of ArcelorMittal Kent Wire said the fight wasn't over. They had expected this outcome and they had already begun preparing to consider all the possible legal options.
I say. And what are the political implications of this?
Well, a major implication is accusations of a U-turn against Labour, who prior to the local elections last year were serious supporters of the Save Chatham Docks campaign. Now their councillors voted to approve the redevelopment on the south side of the docks. They've been accused of saying one thing while in opposition and doing another when they actually have control. Vince Maple, leader of Medway Labour and Medway Council, said the members of the committee voted in a non-political way on the basis of advice from independent planning officers. He also said he facilitated a meeting between the businesses on the site and Peel Waters, who own the land and are behind the application, to try and get negotiations going, and suggested that a possible way forward from here would be the multi-billion euro ArcelorMittal could offer to buy the land they want from Peel, but so far has chosen not to do so. Of course, not everyone was unhappy. James Whittaker, managing director of Peel Waters, said the approved application would create dynamic employment spaces which would drive inward investment into Medway and represents an exciting future for the area. However, it should be said, the application still can't proceed until the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, whoever that may be after the general election, makes a determination on the request for a call-in which was put in, which means that the application is on hold until that point.
Turning to you, Dan, what's been happening down your way?
So I've got another little nugget of information on the Eurostar trains in Kent, or rather the lack thereof. Kent's 2 international train stations haven't actually hosted any services to the continent in more than 4 years now, but there's a slight glimmer of hope that might change soon.
OK. Firstly, why hasn't Kent had any Eurostar trains for so long?
So all services from Ashford and Ebbsfleet international stations to Europe, usually to France and the Netherlands, was suspended indefinitely in March 2020 when COVID lockdown started. Since then, there have been a couple of false starts, with Eurostar saying they'll review the decision to stop services. At one point, they said they might return in 2023, but that didn't happen. There's no such luck. It's been a slightly ridiculous situation, because if you want to go on a train from Kent to the continent now, you have to find your way up to St Pancras, only to zoom straight back through Ashford and Ebbsfleet train stations without actually stopping there.
So what's new, and is there any reason to think that they'll come back?
So Eurostar was in quite a lot of debt. I mean, they still are in quite a lot. And they did face a small risk of competition from prospective new operators on the route. But at a joint council meeting in Ashford the other night, members were told that Eurostar is going to be upgrading and expanding its fleet, that its passenger numbers have jumped by more than 20% compared to last year, and that they've restructured their debt and reduced it by quite significant amounts. No direct plans have been announced for the reinstatement of Eurostar trains in Kent, but the company stays in touch with all the local authorities around here, and councillors say they're confident of some sort of progress within the next year or so of getting these services back to Kent. It helps as well that GetLink, the company which actually owns the Channel Tunnel rather than the trains, is offering €50 million incentive to companies willing to run cross-channel trains, and there are a few who've said they might be interested other than Eurostar. And politicians and campaigners tell me that risk of competition from Eurostar, who basically have a monopoly on it on the moment, might actually kick Eurostar back into running services from Kent.
So, Simon, what's going on at County Hall?
Well, there was finally resolution to the mystery of a woman called Zena Cooke. She suddenly took leave of absence from her £155,000 a year job as the finance director of Kent County Council back in January. No one knew why. Or if they did, they certainly weren't saying. Now it's emerged that she has actually left the authority.
So what are KCC saying to explain this?
Well, it was basically a simple sort of 5-line press release. They bade her a fond farewell and thanked her for all the hard work that she had offered, but they offered no explanation as to why the council suddenly changed her working arrangements back in January, nor did KCC say that this was a redundancy, a restructure or a sacking. We simply don't know.
And will we ever know the truth of what happened?
Time will tell, Robert. Time will tell. Right, now we turn to Paul Francis, the KM Group political editor. What's caught your attention this week?
Well, apparently there's something called an election going on, Simon, so no surprise that we'll be talking about that. And where there's an election, you often find Nigel Farage, and Nigel Farage duly pulled off one of his trademark publicity stunts by announcing that a few days after announcing that he wouldn't be standing in the general election, he announced he would be standing in the general election. Now, unfortunately, you might think, for some people, that's rather regrettable that he's not chosen a seat in Kent to do so. If you cast your mind back, you and I both remember the long night and long morning when he stood in the 2015 general election down in Thanet South and failed. And this is his 8th attempt at trying to get a seat in Parliament.
What do you think his chances are this time?
Well, he's chosen a seat in Clacton, Essex, where the UKIP, which is the...
That was Douglas Carswell's
succeeded in becoming an MP. But I think he did so simply on the strength of changing his affiliation rather than having a by-election. So you never know, but I think one of the interesting factors about his candidacy is that he may face the kind of same coalition of forces that stopped him getting the Thanet South seat back in 2015, which meant there was a lot of tactical voting going on there, and the possibility of tactical voting in Clacton is pretty much the same, but we'll have to wait and see.
It'd be interesting to see if Reform actually convert the polling figures into real figures, and say, for example, they get somewhere between 12.5% and 16% of the vote, which may seem likely or may not actually happen, but we know which seats that will actually cost a Conservative his or her seat.
I think the other dimension to this story is that the Conservative candidates in the Kent seats will feel a little bit relieved that he's not chosen Kent to have another stab at getting into Parliament.
I was just going to say, for what it's worth, I think I reckon if Nigel Farage had chosen a seat in Kent a long time ago and committed to it and worked it consistently for a year or two, pretty much any sort of deprived, working class Brexit voting constituency in Kent, I reckon he would absolutely storm it if he committed to it.
You're from Dover originally, so you know that patch really, really well.
Yeah, I think if he campaigned in Dover and worked it for a year, 18 months, and really hammered it home, I think he would easily become the MP. I've got no doubt about it.
Yeah, that's a good, fair point. I mean, but he did actually pour a lot of energy into Thanet South.
He did.
In terms of the
but there was a tactical vote against him.
Yeah,
people were voting almost for anyone just to make sure that the vote coalesced against him.
Some people still believe he chose the wrong Thanet seat, and he would have been better off taking on Roger Gale in North Thanet.
Also, wherever he goes, doesn't he have a tendency to get Count Bimface and the Monster Raving Loony Party and all these other joke candidates stand there just kind of so they can get a picture of them stood on the podium with him.
Yeah, well, I mean, this week he's become obviously he's taken over from Richard Tice as the leader, who's now become the chair. But even when he's in Clacton, he drew a crowd of about an estimated, high hundreds, possibly 1,000 people there.
There's the standard throw a milkshake at Nigel Farage event. To obviously, is going to catch on perhaps if he carries out more rallies.
Moving on to the TV debates, they kicked off on Tuesday night, where Rishi Sunak took on Keir Starmer in front of an ITV audience. Just general sort of reflections as the beginning of the TV debate season, and that was obviously quite a big one. Bit of a little tempered affair. What did you make of that then, Paul?
Yeah, very tetchy in parts, and tetchy by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. I think he needed a good performance in this TV debate in order to make sure that his Conservative Party wasn't going completely off the rails in this campaign. He had a fairly luckless start to the campaign with these various incidents of getting soaked outside Downing Street when he made the announcement. And I think he just about did enough to keep the wolves from the door, as it were. He was a bit tetchy in parts, but he had a very good attack line in the tax increase that he said that Labour was going to impose. So, and I think Starmer didn't get his foot in at appropriate times to challenge that. He let Rishi Sunak make the ground on that issue.
I think the format, Rishi Sunak really played to the format in the sense of they had 45 seconds in the first instance. And, in, for example, a radio interview, there'll be about 5 minutes, and a lot of politicians tend to use it and think, I'll make these answers as long as possible to take up as much of the time so I'll get asked as few questions as possible. I think what Rishi Sunak's tactic was, Keir Starmer has 45 seconds, I'll interrupt him, I'll throw him off as much as I can so he can't get his message out during that brief period of time. And I think that really unsettled Keir Starmer, meant that, as Paul says, Rishi Sunak could make the argument and Keir Starmer didn't really find a place to rebut.
But don't you also think that it managed to irritate the audience quite a lot as well?
I mean, yes, absolutely. I thought the whole debate itself was kind of incredibly frustrating, but I think, as we've seen, a lot of people talking about this tax line that
he came with one thing to say.
Yeah, and he got his attack line in right
12 times.
And, it did put Starmer on the back foot, I thought. And, what's making the headlines straight afterwards and has continued for this week, it's the tax rise that Labour's going to impose.
So, I mean, obviously Sunak, when he was going on about the, line that Labour's policies will cost you $2,000. He didn't explain the maths of that, but he kept saying, "Oh, it's been calculated by independent Treasury officials." When I was listening to it, I was sat there thinking, I was like, surely he's not got independent civil servants in the Treasury calculating, doing maths for his political tax lines. It's not possible. And I said to my friends who I was watching it with, I was like, I bet you anything that wasn't Treasury people. And then literally the morning after, we read that a senior Treasury official was told the BBC it wasn't Treasury people. I don't know who it was yet. But yeah, so I don't think the blowback from that will be that significant. But it slightly hampers the attack line.
OK, well, we'll have a look at the next opinion polls when they come out post the first TV interview.
One quick point there, Simon, is that the audience for the TV debate was around about 5.5 million at peak times, and I think that just shows you that there is an interest and appetite out there for.
Do you think that's because people are interested in politics or they're interested in the progress of change?
I don't know the answer to that.
OK, another week. The polls are no better for the Tories. First electoral calculus, then YouGov, then Survation. All carried out MRPs, which are sort of large sample mega polls with sophisticated algorithms. Perhaps, Paul, you'd like to reflect on what we've seen so far in the last three?
Yes. Well, if you're a politician and you're on the wrong side of these polls, the standard response is to say the only poll that matters is the one on election day, and I think you're going to hear a lot of that from beleaguered Conservatives in Kent. Now, some of these polls suggest that there could be virtually close to a wipeout in Kent. I don't necessarily agree with that particular forecast. I think the polls are accurate in pointing to very troubled, difficult time for the Conservatives in Kent. It's probably the worst that I've seen it, certainly since 1997. But, some of these polls are suggesting seats like Sevenoaks could go to Labour. Now, Sevenoaks is, what you'd call traditional Tory Shire constituency, and I find it difficult to think that Labour would take that seat. And you could say the same about Tunbridge and Malling, very strong Conservative majorities there, active MPs. So these polls have to be taken with a note of caution, but they do point to some fairly
bleak news. Yeah, if you look back on the three polls, the first of which came out was the electoral calculus. It said that the Conservative Party was going to slump to a possible 66 seats, and then YouGov a day or two later said that it could be 140 seats for the Tories, and then Survation, which is interesting because this was the closest to the electoral calculus prediction, of 71 seats. So there's a pattern beginning to emerge here, but you would imagine, I presume, that the YouGov sample, which was much larger than the other two, would perhaps be the one that you would be more likely to veer towards.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, there's various kind of nuances in all these polls, which, do sort of complicate the picture. But as I said, the challenge for the Tories is how do they make up the ground in, albeit a longer campaign, 4 weeks to go after this week? Can they do enough to reverse their fortunes and see their poll ratings improve? Be interesting if the UK was a bit like France. I think they suspend polls for about 10 days up to election day.
Yeah.
And I think the polls don't always get it right. We've seen that before with, what year was it? 17, wasn't it? And Theresa May managing to lose effectively the election, although she went on to become Prime Minister.
But there were other factors at work in that. There was the whole business of the dementia tax. There was also the length of the campaign, the fact that in a lot of constituencies the Tories hadn't even got a candidate and had to rush a candidate into position.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's happened in Kent, isn't it, in the last few days or so, Candidates who weren't appointed to some constituencies in the county were rushing around, arranging selection meetings and appointing people who've got barely a few weeks to get themselves known around the constituents.
But if this polling does prove to be even sort of slightly correct, and the Labour Party sits with 400 plus MPs and a massive majority, there's no problem about getting any of your legislation or any of your policies through. But then it does create an internal problem because you're probably going to get a lot of MPs you didn't expect to getting seats, and then you also have the business of only being able to give jobs, i.e., ministerships and government jobs too. And there'll be a lot of people kicking their heels, probably some very ambitious ones, who won't get anything, and that just sort of causes the problem that you get with massive majorities in terms of restless backbenchers.
Yeah, it takes us back to the high number of Conservative MPs who are standing down at the election. Is this a sign that they've seen the writing on the wall?
Another debate that seems to have moved away from its original source is over immigration. Not so much immigration, but onto migration caps. Just fill us in with that, Dan.
So the Reform Party are trying to build this as the immigration election. Whether or not it feels like that, I think, is debatable. I don't think immigration as polling is like one of the top concerns, but it's obviously something that still matters to people. And like I think I've said in this podcast before, I thought the major parties like talking about illegal migration because it's easier than talking about legal migration. But we always know what Reform's policy was on legal migration, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think is still a complete freeze on migration. They haven't, as far as I know, haven't really explained how that would be feasible. But in the past few days, both the two parties that actually have a chance of governing have given a little bit more detail on their immigration policy. So the Conservatives have said they would introduce an immigration cap, or at least that's what the headlines said. But if you ever read it, the substance of the policy, it's that their Parliament would vote on a number for a cap, and then this would be the final decision on it, or a recommendation would essentially be outsourced to a quango designed to regulate immigration numbers, which is it's an avoidance of political responsibility for it. It's the gift of Parliament to decide that kind of thing. They would, rather than take responsibility and say we only want X number of migrants, they would rather give it to a quango.
It does beg the question, if it's such a fantastic idea, why wasn't it brought in years ago?
Yeah, exactly. They've had, the British Parliament is the most constitutionally powerful government in the world. British government can do absolutely anything it wants, free of, the only constraints are political. If they wanted to cap immigration, they could have done it. And yet immigration has consistently risen for, since the mid-90s now. Whereas Labour have, also said they want a cap on immigration. They won't give an actual number, but they've proposed, they said they want a lower migration, not necessarily a cap, but they've proposed their alternatives, which would be a ban on bosses who are found to be paying below the minimum wage from hiring people from abroad, and also making it so that when companies want to recruit people from abroad for training purposes, they have to show that they were attempting to hire British workers first, and which is more substantive policy than outsourcing it to a quango. But I still think legal migration will be a problem for a likely Labour government in a very short period of time, because, like I said, people voted for low immigration in pretty much every election in this country for decades now, and it's consistently increased, and it will cause instability in the Labour Party, because I don't think it's an exaggeration to say there are very large numbers of members and politicians of the Labour Party who view essentially any regulation of migration whatsoever as at best unpalatable and at most straight up morally wrong.
Well, they've got Natalie Elphicke now in their balance.
True.
Who may take an interesting position on that.
She's pulled the average position on migration quite far away just by her presence.
Is there a topic that you would like to be discussed on the Kent Politics Podcast? Perhaps you've got a question for one of our panel, or you'd like to comment on a hot topic in local or national government. Get in touch by emailing or sending a voice note to kentpoliticspodcast@thekmgroup.co.uk.
David Naghi has been a prominent, some may say unique figure in Maidstone public life for 3 decades. Now he is hoping to become the Liberal Democrat MP for the newly configured Maidstone and Malling seat, held until recently by Helen Grant, the Conservative. Afternoon, Dave. How's it been going then?
It's been going very well, actually. I'm having great support as the Liberal Democrat candidate. People really don't really want to vote Conservative ever again, the ones I'm coming across. And it's very positive for us at the moment.
Just tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, obviously I've lived in Maidstone nearly all my life. Obviously I was born in America, been here since I was 3. So Maidstone is my passion. I've lived here. I want Maidstone and Malling to be the best. I want them to have the best facilities, and I'm going to do my best to represent them, because I actually have the same issues myself. I get stuck in the same traffic as everyone. I get the same trouble with trying to get a doctor's appointment. So I know what it's like where I live, and hopefully people will realise that.
Okay. Just tell us, how did you get into politics?
Many years ago when I was young, I went to a place called the Howard Warden Centre in Maidstone, which is still going. It's just off of Blewett Street, off of Boxley Road. There's an alleyway that connects the two. And I started the Under-14 Youth Club at Howard Walton all those years ago. And I just progressed with youth work, became an official youth worker. And I've done youth work in all my life, basically. And I met the local Lib Dems there, because it is true, they are the only ones you see during the course of the year or hear from. A lady called Margaret Shaw, who's recently passed away, sadly. So she won't see me become the next MP of Maidstone and Malling, which have been great. But yes, I see them and I got involved. I stood in 2002. I become a member in 98, and I've been a councillor since 2002.
Okay. Well, given your sort of working class background, your working class credentials, why didn't you join the Labour Party?
In my personal view, the Labour Party hasn't been for working class people for many years. Tony Blair sort of finished that off, in my opinion. And it's a bit like the unions. Unions used to have union representative where you worked, but all the unions seem to be in London now in offices and don't really have much connection with the workforce, because they're all in their offices. And that's what's wrong with the Labour Party, controlled by the unions and not working people.
So you say that the Labour Party is not the Labour Party and still controlled by the unions?
Yes.
Why do you think the Labour Party has betrayed its sort of core values, in your opinion?
I don't know what's gone on in the background, but over the years, working class people have not been the number one priority. When the Lib Dems were in coalition with the Conservatives, we put up the tax threshold because the Conservatives were forgetting about working class people, as always. And in my view, the Lib Dems are more for working class people than the Labour Party or any other party.
Despite the time and resources you have devoted to this seat, Labour is still predicted to win. Why are you bothering?
I don't know where those figures are coming from or who's doing that kind
Well, it's electoral calculus and others. Are others saying it's going to be a Conservative hold or a likely Conservative hold, or it's going to be a Labour win? The Liberal Democrats are coming a distant third. In fact, electoral calculus give you 0% chance of winning that seat.
Well, I would compare that to Maidstone United playing Ipswich. In my view, if you look at how people voted locally in the last local elections, majority voters were Lib Dem. Second was Conservative, and way down the pecking order was the Labour Party. So locally, we're very strong. We have 9 in the centre of Maidstone, where we're very strong.
9 what? 9 councillors?
9 wards.
9 wards, yeah.
9 wards in the centre of Maidstone. And the Malling bit is 5 wards over there, where 3 of those wards, Ditton, East Malling and West Malling, we're very strong. We even have county councillor over there, and the other 2 are Conservative. So going back to facts, the actual people that vote, in the last local elections, we did very well. We had more votes than the Conservatives. And I'm going to make sure that goes into the general election.
The thing is that you're basing those sort of numbers on local election results, which, I'm not disputing them. The turnout tends to be sort of double in a general election, and that completely skews the likely scenario and the likely result.
Well, this general election is completely different to anything we've had before, because the Conservative Party has destroyed itself, and that is speaking to Conservatives. If you talk to a lot of Conservatives, they will tell you that. And where those disgruntled Conservative voters are going to go, they could come to us. And of course, obviously, there's a new party called Reform, which reminds me of UKIP all those years ago. That was another party formed by someone. And then all of a sudden that disappeared after the elections. And that was a great letdown, because a lot of people thought UKIP was the next party for government. That obviously didn't happen. And now we have the same sort of scenario, a new party with disgruntled Conservatives who are multimillionaires who can pay for people to stand at these elections and think they're going to take control of the government. Well, that's not going to happen, is it?
It's interesting you mentioned the Reform Party, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But, I mean, in all honesty, you would need the Labour Party and the Green Party tactical voters not vote for those parties and then sort of coalesce behind you. But why would the Labour Party do that if they're currently most likely to win, according to the pollsters?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. All I can say is that in the next general election, I'm hoping that Labour and Green voters will look at the Lib Dems and say, look, they've got the best chance of taking the MP out. We have the best chance of winning.
So
that's what my argument would be on the doorstep. That's what is my argument, is that the Lib Dems are the only people that can beat the Conservatives in Maidstone and Malling.
What are the big issues coming up on the doorstep?
The big issues is obviously cost of living, National Health Service, and the state of our rivers and seas with sewage.
Oh, really? Those are the 3. What about roads and lack of infrastructure, house building, anything?
Well, housing targets are coming up, especially over the Malling side, and with Maidstone, with the local plan that's just gone through. Malling itself, there's big developments around by Preston Hall, Hermitage Lane. There's a development there going to be going on to, we haven't got planning permission yet, but they're going for it, at the research station, which will link into Hermitage Lane.
That's the one in East Malling, yeah?
Yeah, it starts off at East Malling and ends up in Hermitage Lane. Well, if that goes through, that will be utter chaos. There's supposed to be a new roundabout going in. So there'll be 2,000 dwellings, 2,000 motors, possibly on that roundabout, and another development called the Poppies, where they could have 2,000 motors possibly going out onto this roundabout. It's utter chaos. Whenever we have MPs talking or sending letters, because they don't usually turn up to meetings, they say that infrastructure has to come first and save our green and open spaces. Well, none of those things are happening with this government.
OK, you also serve in the coalition cabinet at Maidstone Borough Council. Will you be giving that up if you do become an MP?
Well, obviously I can't do everything. But
not even you.
I can stay I'm a cabinet member at the moment, but I could stay. I'd probably give that up, but could stay as a councillor.
Okay.
Because a lot of people have done that before, and it would help me get in touch with the council as well.
We've seen the emergence of Nigel Farage in this election campaign, and this week he became the Reform UK leader. How much influence overall do you think Reform UK can have on the overall election result in the UK?
Well, that's the grey area. In my view, why he changed his mind in a week, because obviously he's entitled to change his mind, as he says, is because Reform wasn't getting the publicity that it needed. That's what was happening. And as soon as he changed his mind and said he was standing, he was on television nearly all day and the evening, in the papers the next day. So if you want publicity, that's the way to do it. As for what they're going to do if they get to power, I don't think no one really knows.
Okay. But I mean, a strong Reform vote doesn't take votes from the Liberal Democrats. It's going to rob them most likely from Helen Grant. So a good Reform, an active Reform candidate in Mason and Malling is actually good for you, isn't it?
Well, I don't know how active he is. I don't know how much money he's got to spend, but I'm hoping, I know I'll be putting literature out. I haven't seen anyone else's literature yet, but in due course, we've got four full weeks to go yet. So there's time for paperwork to come out, but I'll be interested to see what they are. But all I know is that I will do my utmost and my best in my term of office as an MP for Mason and Malling to make sure that even myself has a better standard of living where I live. And that's what MP should do. Tracy Crouch, who stood down for Aylesford, is now in Malling. She was how MP should be, representing the people that voted for her. And if you got in touch with Tracy Crouch, you got a response, you got some action. And that's how MP should be.
Staying with Reform, I mean, Reform, they could well be the party which influences the extent to which the Conservatives lose. But even in the background, I spoke to a pretty senior Reform background person today, and we were talking about the polls, because I think one poll had Reform sitting at about 15%, which is probably the highest it's ever been. And he said, never believe a poll that makes you smile. So I don't know quite what that means, except obviously just take them with a pinch of salt and let's see what happens on polling day.
You've got to remember, with Reform, you've got Tice and Farage have all been on the television. They have regular programmes. People see them most weeks. You can tune in and see them on the television. So, you see them, you think, oh, I agree with that. And that's probably why people could be doing it in the polls, But in this election, they're supposed to cover everyone fairly. And if you notice, no other parties are getting mentioned on the television. But that's where the Lib Dems will come through, and especially in Conservative areas.
I mean, in Kent, obviously the number one target is Tunbridge Wells. You're just taking control of the council. The polling seems to reflect a Liberal Democrat win. They haven't allocated much resource to you, David, for Maidstone and Malling. They clearly don't think that's winnable.
It's like anything, you don't know until the final whistle, till the end of the day on the 4th of July at 10 o'clock, and it's all counted. No one really knows. But I've got lots of support in Maidstone. I should be doing my best to reassure people that if I'm elected, I would do the best I can to represent them. And that's all I can do. But people have to decide. And that's what I'm going to try and persuade them. But you just can't tell. Look at what would you have said before the local elections in Tunbridge Wells? You wouldn't have betted on that. You wouldn't have betted on the Lib Dems taking over Tunbridge Wells, would you? And then all of a sudden, we have an election and people are so disgruntled, upset with the Conservative government, they're not voting for them. And that's what's unusual about this general election. One of the main parties who are supposed to be strong on law and order, we got anarchy at the moment. They get rid of 10,000 police officers, the most experienced ones, take another 10,000 on a couple of years later, but there isn't the police officers to train them because all the experienced ones have gone. They're tough. They just let everyone down. And this is why I think they're going to get wiped out.
I did an interview with you earlier this year and you described it as neglect.
Neglect. This Conservative government has forgot to govern. They've been too busy thinking about themselves and how to look after the Conservative Party. This is what's not happened with this government. Yeah. They've put themselves first, party first, and not the country. And that is what everyone is fed up with. And keep telling everyone around here, we have to take, Maidstone was 17,000 houses, dwellings, and think Tunbridge and Malling is 16,000 in the local plan. And they haven't got a local plan at the moment. And forcing councillors to find somewhere to put them places is out of order. They shouldn't just set a target. I know we need houses, but they need to be in the right place. And forcing local councillors to find somewhere to put that target is just out of order. It's not the way to go. Needs to change.
Do you think that these houses are clearly not always affordable to local people? I mean, should there be a much greater emphasis on providing social housing, affordable rental markets, first-time buyer type properties, studios, 1-bedroom, small 2-bedroom flats where young people can, get on board the property ladder? Would that be a better way to use those housing allocations or those housing targets?
I don't know where a better way is, but we need to have some common sense. And at the moment, people buy properties and they get maintenance charges. It's a big problem for people moving in. They get promised the maintenance charges won't go up, but they do, and they can't afford it. I know one of my friends, in November, he had a letter saying his maintenance charges were going up £300 and he had to find that in the next month. This is the cost of living. But that's legislation, though, isn't it? You legislate against that. You see where the potential pitfalls might be, and these houses wouldn't be in private ownership; they would be in some sort of form of public ownership, surely. So that's what you legislate for. That's why we have. An example there. Maidstone Council had about 7,000 or 8,000 houses, about 10 years ago, and the government was refusing to let them borrow money to do them up. And we had to let them go to a housing trust, which is Golden Homes now. And now it's best for the council to start buying properties again because it's cheaper. It's just what a silly system. We had all those houses, but the government would let us borrow money to do them up. And now it's cheaper for the council to go out and buy properties to house people in Maidstone. We need a bit of common sense brought back into the politics a bit. It's gone. And I've been on the doorstep of people have been saying to me, Liz Truss was their worst nightmare because their savings have gone down. The Liz Truss era has caused a lot of older people to suffer financially.
David Naghi, many thanks for your time today, and we'll be watching the result of the Maidstone and Moling election very carefully indeed. OK, folks, that's your lot for this week. Thanks to Rob, Dan, Paul and to our special guest, Liberal Democrat Dave Naghi. We'll have another packed pod next week and I hope you can join us then. You can follow us on X, formerly Twitter. Just search for Kent Politics Podcast. Also, don't forget to tune in to KMTV at 5 p.m. each Friday for its politics show. All the best. See you later.
Thanks for listening to the Kent Politics Podcast. Don't forget to check out stories throughout the week on the politics page of Kent Online. And you can watch the Kent Politics Show with Rob Bailey on KMTV every Friday at 5 p.m. or on demand at kmtv.co.uk.
This has been an I Am Listening original podcast. For more information, head over to our website, im-listening.co.uk.